You've probably heard the name Ragnar Lothbrok, maybe from a TV show, maybe from a video game, a Viking king who raided Paris, terrorized England, and died in a pit of snakes laughing at his own death. It sounds like myth. It sounds too big to be true. But the real answer is far stranger than the legend, because historians still argue about whether Ragnar Lothbrok was one man, or four men, or a story stitched together by monks who needed a villain terrifying enough to explain their own defeat. And somewhere underneath centuries of saga and exaggeration, there might be a real person, a real raider, a real reason an entire continent learned to fear a longship on the horizon. Let's start with what people actually believed about him. The sagas say Ragnar was descended from gods. They say he wrestled a giant serpent to win his first wife and wore trousers boiled in tar and sand, so the creature's fangs couldn't pierce his skin. That's where the name comes from. Lothbrok. It means hairy breeches. Not exactly the title you'd expect for history's most feared raider, but fear doesn't need a dignified name. It just needs results. And Ragnar, if the stories are even half true, delivered results that shook an empire. In the year 845, a Viking fleet sailed up the Seine River toward Paris. Not a small raiding party. Historical chronicles describe as many as 120 ships, thousands of warriors, the kind of force that doesn't come to trade. It comes to take. Picture it for a moment. You're a monk standing on the walls of a monastery outside Paris. You've heard rumors for weeks, ships moving up the river, villages burning behind them. And then one morning you see the horizon fill with sails, dozens of them moving in formation like nothing your world has ever produced. There is no army waiting to stop them. There is only fear and the sound of oars cutting through water. Paris was terrified. The king of West Francia, Charles the Bald, didn't have an army capable of stopping them. So he did something that tells you everything about how desperate the situation had become. He paid them off. Historians estimate the ransom at around 7,000 pounds of silver and gold, an amount that would have taken years to collect through taxation. He handed over a fortune just to make the raiders leave. That's not the story of a man being defeated. That's the story of a man being feared into profit. Some chronicles name the leader of that raid as Ragnar. Sound familiar? Many historians believe this is the same figure, later immortalized as Ragnar Lothbrok. His real actions blurred and inflated over centuries of retelling until the man became a legend and the legend became bigger than the man. Here's where it gets strange, though. The historian Neil Price, one of the leading archaeologists studying the Viking Age, has argued that Ragnar likely wasn't a single historical person at all. Instead, Price suggests the name may have absorbed the achievements of several different Viking leaders across different decades, merged into one unforgettable character by storytellers who needed a hero big enough to carry an entire saga tradition. Think about why that would happen. Sagas weren't written down until centuries after these events, often by Christian monks in Iceland working from oral traditions passed down for generations. Every time a story is told again, something changes. A detail gets sharper, a victory gets bigger, a defeat gets reframed as a trick. By the time Ragnar's saga was finally written, it wasn't just describing a man. It was building a legend Viking society wanted to believe in. You do the same thing without realizing it. Think about the last time you retold a story about something that happened to you. Did the wave get a little bigger? Did the near miss get a little closer? You weren't lying exactly. You were doing what humans have always done with memory, sharpening it until it's worth repeating. Now imagine that process running for 200 years, across an ocean, through generations of storytellers who never met the man they were describing. That's how Hairy Breeches becomes a demigod who wrestles serpents. But strip away the serpents and the gods for a second and ask a simpler question. What would it actually take to lead men like this? Viking raiding wasn't a solo activity, it was an economy. Ships had to be built plank by craftsmen who understood exactly how to make a hull flexible enough to survive open ocean and shallow enough to slide up a river undetected. Crews had to be fed, armed, and paid, usually in a share of whatever was taken. A leader who couldn't deliver results didn't stay a leader for long. Loyalty in this world wasn't given. It was earned, raid after raid, with silver. So whoever stood behind the name Ragnar, whether one man or several, had to be someone who consistently delivered, someone whose ships came home heavier than they left. That's not luck, that's a track record. And track records are exactly the kind of thing that gets remembered, retold, and eventually mythologized into something bigger than a single human being could ever actually be. And the sons mattered just as much as the father. Ragnar's sons, if you believe the sagas, were just as ferocious. Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan. These names appear in real historical records describing the great heathen army that invaded England in the year 865. This wasn't a raid anymore. This was an invasion, a force large enough to conquer entire Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, not just plunder them and sail away. Ivar's nickname alone has puzzled historians for a century. The Boneless. Some believe it referred to a physical condition, possibly a connective tissue disorder that affected his mobility. Others think it was a poetic exaggeration meant to describe a man so flexible or so cunning in battle that his enemies joked he had no bones at all. Either explanation tells you the same thing. Ivar was memorable enough that people needed an explanation for why. The historian Kat Jarman, who has spent years studying Viking era remains found in England, has traced physical evidence connecting mass burial sites directly to the era of the Great Heathen Army. Her research on a mass grave in Repton, England, revealed skeletons showing violent deaths consistent with battle, buried together in a way that suggests a coordinated military force, not a scattered band of opportunists. So even if Ragnar himself is part myth, his son's war was devastatingly real. 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms stood in England before that war. By the time it ended, 3 of them had fallen. Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia were conquered or crippled. Only Wessex, under a young king named Alfred, managed to survive. Alfred would go on to be remembered as Alfred the Great, and part of the reason history remembers him that way is because of exactly how close England came to disappearing entirely under the sons of a legendary raider. Think about that for a second. If Wessex had fallen too, there might not be an England the way you know it today. No English language spreading across the world the way it did. No English monarchy tracing its lineage back through the centuries that followed. One kingdom held, one king refused to break, and the reason he had to be that strong in the first place traces back to a war that started, according to the sagas, because of what happened to one man in a pit of snakes. That's the strange weight of the story. A legend, possibly exaggerated, possibly merged from several different men, may have set in motion consequences real enough to shape the map of Europe. And the ending, the part everyone remembers, the snake pit? According to the legend, Ragnar was eventually captured by King Ella of Northumbria, who threw him into a pit full of venomous snakes to die. And as the poison spread through his body, Ragnar is said to have laughed and declared that the piglets will grunt when they hear how the old boar suffered, a warning that his sons would come for revenge. They did. The great heathen army's invasion of England is described in several sagas as a direct response to Ragnar's death. Whether or not the snake pit actually happened the way the stories describe, historians agree that something triggered an unusually massive, unusually coordinated Viking invasion of England in the 860s. Something personal, something that turned raiding into conquest. Here's the question worth sitting with. Why did this story survive when so many others didn't? Because it isn't really about ships or silver or snake pits. It's about legacy. It's about a father whose death became so significant that his sons reorganized an entire war around avenging him. Ragnar's story endured for the same reason certain stories always endure. It taps into something that hasn't changed in over 1,000 years, the fear of being forgotten, the hope that what you build or what you suffer will matter to the people who come after you. The historian Judith Jesch, an expert in Old Norse language and Viking Age culture, has pointed out that Norse society placed enormous weight on reputation after death. A Viking's greatest fear wasn't dying in battle. It was dying without anyone remembering how they died. Fame was survival. A good story was a kind of immortality. That's why the details got bigger with every retelling. That's why Ragnar became descended from gods. That's why hairy breeches became a name whispered in fear across the courts of Europe. Not because it was strictly true, but because it needed to be unforgettable. And maybe that's not so different from now. You've probably noticed it yourself. The stories that spread aren't always the most accurate ones. They're the most memorable ones. The ones with a detail sharp enough to repeat, a name strange enough to remember, a death dramatic enough that someone tells it again at dinner, slightly bigger than it actually was. Think about how quickly a story spreads online today. Nobody fact-checks it before sharing. Nobody waits to confirm every detail. If it's strange enough, if it's dramatic enough, it moves. 1,000 years ago, that same instinct didn't need a screen. It just needed a fire, a long winter, and someone willing to tell the story one more time. Every time you share a story that's been exaggerated just a little, you're doing exactly what those Icelandic monks did 1,000 years ago. You're keeping someone alive in the only way that's ever really worked. Not through silver, not through conquest, through being impossible to stop talking about. So when you hear the name Ragnar Lothbrok again, remember this. It might be one man. It might be four. The trousers might have been tar-soaked, or that detail might have been invented decades later around a fire in Iceland. But somewhere underneath the myth, there was a raid up a river that terrified an empire into paying for peace. And whether or not the legend is exactly true, it did exactly what legends are built to do.